Hi everyone, I am Camille Dalkey. I will be facilitating the webinar. Today we'll be talking with Rocky C. and David Hilt. Rocky is the CEO of SOS International and David is President of Grid Reliability Consulting. SOS and GRC have formed an exclusive partnership to provide CIP-014 guidance to utilities as well as other compliance services. In today's webinar, we will be discussing CIP-014 and physical protection. At this point, I'll turn it over to Rocky C.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on NERC Reliability Standard CIP-014. SOS works every day to bring solutions to the industry that make a difference and make your daily challenges easier. Today, we're going to focus on CIP-014. SOS has formed a collaboration of 4 companies to offer an end-to-end solution to CIP-014. David Hilt and his company, Grid Reliability Consulting, have joined SOS in this effort as part of the SOS compliance program. David will lead the webinar today. David brings more than 40 years of experience to SOS and our clients. David serves as the lead on projects dealing with grid resiliency and physical security, compliance, critical infrastructure protection, and reliability. David is a leading expert in bulk power system reliability, including planning, design, operations, and compliance. He works with numerous clients across North America on projects relating to the electric grid. Please welcome David Hilt as he presents a reasoned approach to CIP-014 and physical protection.
Thank you, Rocky. As we go to the next slide, if you don't mind, Rocky, it should say topics for discussion. Thank you. Physical security is a very, very challenging task for the bulk electric system, as everybody knows, both here in the U.S. and elsewhere. The North American electric grid has been really identified as the largest integrated machine in the world. And of course, it's spread out, it's many, many components, it's vast, and it's extremely difficult to protect all of it from all types of attacks and all types of events. As we well know, we've been through this in the industry for many, many years. Today, I want to share my experiences in developing and implementing a reasoned approach to much of what was involved following some attacks, and for utilities that have been engaged in this, where I've been engaged working with them in the past. Much of this was pre-CIP-014, so it's been very, very interesting. So some of the topics I wanted to cover today are some of the developments that are driving this and why it's not going to go away. Some of the program goals and objectives if you're developing a program on grid resiliency and physical security. Of course, CIP-014 is front and center on everyone's mind since it's been recently approved by FERC, and there's some dates coming up this year that everyone's going to need to be compliant with some aspects of that standard. Physical security evaluation needs, benefits, expertise, resources, what it's going to take to do these kinds of projects, what kind of a project scope you're going to look at, some things that I've done recently to share some of the results that I've seen, or some of the things you might want to be watching out for out there. And then typically what I've done in terms of reports and deliverables, and then I think we'll have some time hopefully for some questions and follow-up. Next slide, please, Rocky. So I think we all know why we're thinking about physical security. While we built the bulk electric system and our systems to reliably serve our customers, it's become so much more and central to the functioning of our modern society, and we know that. The federal government knows this, and certainly here's some Department of Defense comments. I spent my December 31st, 1999 in the basement of the Forrestal building in Washington, D.C. with the Department of Energy. And certainly in the weeks and months leading up to the Y2K event, the sense that I get from even DOE was that they had reached the conclusion that the electric grid was the critical infrastructure. Every other infrastructure was critical, but without the electric grid, telecommunications, water and sewer, banking and finance, none of the rest of these things where we were worrying about Y2K rollover was going to work. So I think that's really when the federal government first picked up on that. Following that, President Carter at the time directed the new Department of Homeland Security to develop a report on critical infrastructures, and there are now 17 listed in that report. You can go to the DHS website and find it. 17 critical infrastructures, of which energy is number one. And there's a note that all 16 below it, below energy, require some form of energy to continue to operate. It used to have electric pulled out separately, but they combined all of that into energy. So for those various reasons, we know that this is here to stay, and it has, very, very high level government attention. Rocky, if you go to the next slide, please. So what has focused the attention now on grid resiliency again? Well, certainly physical security is one part of it. And on this particular slide on the left is a substation on the West Coast that had a physical attack, and I think many of you probably seen this diagram. It's public, it's out on the internet. It shows where the shooters, and there were multiple shooters, shooting into a particular 500 to 230 kV to 115 kV substation, and did some significant damage, and they knew exactly what they were shooting at. They really didn't waste bullets. They cut fiber optics, and I think all of that's public information. On the right is a little bit of, this is out of a White House report on resiliency, dated August of 2013, and so they're literally looking at the billions of dollars in costs of some of these major events that have happened on the system, and really starting to focus on the need for grid resiliency. And certainly the events that we see happening regularly are continuing to drive that. Everything from snowstorms to ice storms to the superstorm Sandy, hurricanes Isaac and even Katrina, as I'm sitting here in New Orleans today. Go to the next slide, please, Rocky. So other factors that play into the overall grid resiliency. Well, certainly we have physical and cyber attacks. We've seen at least a couple of various events, three or four actually, that are physical attacks. We know of events where people are observing the electric grid, and in fact, the particular facility in the West, there was a second event where right as I actually walked into that substation the next day, a few days later, at night, there were people spotted out in that field again observing what was happening, and they're not really sure. They never captured them, so they don't know what was quite up. Certainly extreme weather events, Hurricane Sandy, drought. I spent some time looking at drought situations in Texas and water, the ability to have cooling water and so forth. And other infrastructure interdependencies are rather significant here. I can tell you the event in the West, we were looking at everything from the particular, where there are server farms, large server farms that someone was trying to outage. Maybe the grid wasn't the target. Maybe the grid was, the electric supply was a way to get to the target. Things like major oil refineries, et cetera, may well be part of that. So it begins to expand a little bit. Asset management, aging infrastructure plays into the overall grid resiliency. We have a lot of equipment out there. EEI will give you some data on the age. That most of the transmission lines now in the United States are 50 years old. Transformers 50 and 70 years old. So we have a lot of equipment and structures out there. And I know I was working on a project looking at some of the Cortan steel. Certainly it was supposed to go up, rust, seal itself off. Well, guess what? It still doesn't last forever. And then certainly what's on everybody's mind today, compliance with CIP-014. We know we have to do that. We have some dates coming up in October 1 and December 30th this year for doing some work for those. And just really resiliency for system operations. And I'd like, I'll give Terry Boston at PJM a lot of credit. I was at a conference on grid resiliency, and he told the story about how when he was a kid, he took up a paper route because he wanted to buy a watch, and he'd seen the commercial with Patrick Swayze making the argument that it takes a licking and keeps on ticking, and that's how he felt we should be with the grid and grid resiliency. So a lot of things going on there. So the challenge is, how do we take these factors into consideration, meet the requirements of CIP-014, and ensure reliability for our business continuity, customer service, and even the health, safety, and societal reasons that we need to do. So Rocky, if you go to the next slide, please. So identifying project goals and scope is key. We need to take a look and see if we can build some context within which we want to do such a project. First, with all of the factors affecting grid resiliency, the scope of the analysis is going to have to be defined. So as we go through the project, are we just focusing on physical security and CIP-014? That's fairly simple. It won't take in all of the facilities that you'll have to do an analysis of them. There's a screening in it that you'll do. Are we focusing on grid resiliency and looking at some of these other threats that are out there? Is that part of an overall corporate effort that's underway? Are we going to focus on corporate due diligence and business continuity and for some of our customers, and include other infrastructure dependencies, things like water and sewer, transportation systems. NERC mentions military bases and other things in one of their implementation guides. So you need to take a look at, what are we really going to consider in the scope of this overall project, as we're going through and doing this. Once the scope is identified, then we can identify who the subject matter experts that we're going to need to work on this. I've listed here a number of them, folks related to protection systems, substation design, equipment specs, communication systems, folks involved with risk assessments, statistical studies and historical patterns if you're looking at any sorts of weather-related events, and transmission system steady state and transient analysis obviously are key and critical. And then your physical security folks will also will need to be there. Rocky, if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the approach is, the next step in the process after identifying the scope and the threats is to identify what is at risk. So in the previous step, one of the things we're looking at is what threats, it's a threat analysis in addition to identifying the scope. The first part of it is really a threat. What threats are we wanting to look at, overall? But once you've identified the threats, then we're going to do a risk assessment. And the risk assessment is the next step in the process. And we need to identify what's at risk within the facility. So are we looking strictly at the bulk power system, to other critical infrastructures, to other potential targets? We need to identify the components within the facilities. Once we've identified the facilities and elements that are presenting the greatest risk to the greatest scope, then we want to identify the components within those facilities that are at risk. And traditionally, what we've done is for physical security folks, we've done a really good job in a lot of cases of protecting the perimeters of our facilities, but we haven't really looked hard at what's in those facilities, what components may be at risk. And that really gets into identifying the potential methods of attack. We want to know what we want to do, how we want to approach this, and specifically with knowledge, someone that knows a little bit about what they're doing. And certainly there are military types and disgruntled employees and a whole series of folks who with some knowledge can seek to do some harm. And then ultimately develop protection plans and recommendations. And I always like to say this, absolutely, we know it's unrealistic to protect everything. We have miles and miles of transmission lines, so the system is large and diverse. Not going to be able to protect the substation from the plane flying into the substation scenario, but we can start with some common sense and some low-hanging fruit to protect it. I just saw an article today about a facility in the upper Midwest where a transformer failed, and it was apparently in a foggy situation. It looked like it was shooting a beam of light straight up into the sky out of it as it failed. And if you read the internet, there's a lot of people that were arguing that suddenly there's some sort of a space-based weapon that somebody had sighted onto the equipment to cause it to fail. Well, obviously we wouldn't be able to protect from that either, but I found that kind of interesting. Next slide, please, Rocky. So the new standard for physical security, and I think everybody's pretty familiar with that. The requirements that we're focusing on immediately, obviously, are R1 and R2. The risk assessment has to be completed by October 1 and verified by December 30th. The requirements go on further to conduct an evaluation of potential threats and vulnerabilities of a physical attack, and they're on the respective transmission stations and primary control centers, and then develop and implement physical security plans to address those, and then have those physical security plans verified. And there's periodic activities. We don't do this just one time, depending on whether you find facilities or you don't find facilities in your first analysis that meet the criteria. Then you will be doing some follow-up work. Let's go to the next slide, Rocky, if you don't mind. So some of the recent work that I've done has been doing, was actually following the event out west and in New York. So I've actually had the opportunity to go out and do some of this work. My approach, interestingly, mirrored what's in CIP-014. So it's been very interesting that it's been even following what's coming in the standard. But one of the most difficult activities is determining what's the most critical, and it ties back to looking strictly at CIP-014. NERC takes the approach of protecting the reliability of the bulk electric system. That's what their charter is about. It does not go to protecting other critical infrastructures, et cetera. They might stretch it to if it's a fuel supply issue for the overall electric grid, but they are focused on the electric grid. So if utilities are interested in looking at other factors, it will be beyond the requirements of CIP-014. And NERC has noted that in some of its guidance documents. But the fundamental data comes from the power flow and the CIP-014 applicability criteria, which is the screening criteria. You will need to do technical assessments of risk to the bulk electric system, and that gets to be challenging because the standard requires that you're going to take a look at a facility if it's rendered inoperable. So you're looking at, if I think about the photograph I had up there earlier of the 500 to 230 to 115 facility, if that facility becomes rendered inoperable, that's a pretty tough solution for bulk power system analysis. There are ways to address this. Certainly, you can recognize that you can complete your studies, and when you reach the point of finding instability, if you have part of the facility outaged and you're reaching instability, then you can obviously conclude that probably for the rest of the facility coming out, you will have instability. There are other techniques that can be used looking at rates of change in reactive and voltage and power flows and so forth to predict some of the probabilities of a cascading event or of instability. So you can do that, but it takes this is going to take a lot of work and quite a bit of time. So I'm not wanting to minimize this. This will take you several months to get through this process if you have a lot of facilities to take a look at. Other things to consider are, even from the electric grid, associated data for cranking paths, your communications and control that may be affected. And I call this first tier. This is data that comes from the utility. So if I have a station in a facility, and I'll show you one that has a lot of microwave, has a microwave tower with it's a hub in the communication system. If that comes out, what else does that affect? and it's not just necessarily about the electric grid. Cranking paths for restoring, if the facility is part of that, that may be of importance to you. You may want to consider that. Certainly other infrastructures, including your fuel supply. If you're relying on natural gas, a lot of the compressor stations today are electric powered instead of natural gas powered due to environmental rules. You may want to look at, if you're in a major metropolitan area, other factors such as transportation systems, oil refineries, things that are, water and sewer, those kinds of things that are necessary to our modern society, and consider those. Certainly, if you were in New York City, you'd be concerned about Wall Street. So that's always been a huge issue. And the process that we use is often verifying the utility's own assessment per CIP-014, and so you'll find that someone coming in with your scope can certainly take a look at those things and do that. The next step then really is to get down to key components. Once I've determined the facilities that are most critical, what makes those facilities up? Is, the lines, the transformers, the shunts, the breakers, the communication systems, the protection systems. What's making those facilities up? And if I was trying to do serious harm to that facility, what's inside of it that I would be trying to do real harm to? That brings us to the point of understanding that our traditional approach for physical protection has been protect the perimeter, keep people out. It started for safety reasons, theft reasons, and now we're trying to keep people out for other CIP reasons, the other CIP standards, et cetera. But it's been primarily a protection to keep the van full of explosives or something out of our facilities. And we get into detailed level identification, looking at bus and one-line diagrams, operating guides, and special protection systems, or in the West, RAS schemes. And we do an on-site inspection, review the physical layout, the design, and vulnerabilities, and what's out there that could be there to remove key components. And I'll show you some examples in a little bit. And then certainly we've used survey tools, things like SurveyMonkey for large efforts, put together some surveys of some of the key people in the company and at the facilities, at remote facilities, to begin to understand what kind of issues they may have or may have seen, or issues they have with the designs. Can we go to the next slide, please, Rocky? Thank you. The scope of recent physical reviews that I've done includes an on-site inspection, and I think it's absolutely critical because we begin looking at communication systems, and I won't tell you where, but I can share some examples of facilities that had their communications were over fiber optics, with a vendor, dual fiber optics, 2 separate vendors, and we've been through that in the CIP standards where we've sometimes found they've gone to the same switching hub somewhere on the telco system. But in this particular case, the 2 telco vendors both buried their fiber optics on opposite sides of the entrance driveway, and then they went up on poles outside of the facility. So if someone with knowledge knew what to do, they could have fairly easily eliminated the communications to that facility. Control and protection systems, obviously they're critical, and particularly when we get into special protection systems that are using communications. The physical design and layout of the facility, cabling and wiring, spare equipment is not something that we want to ignore either. So where are your spares, and are they located on site, off site, and how accessible are they? Again, somebody with knowledge. And then beginning to look at the use of best practices, what we see on site, and there are some really good practices out there. It obviously takes a lot of collaboration with the personnel and the subject matter experts, and then obviously a final report detailing findings and conclusions. And I often recommend that there's two may be necessary. One that is critical energy infrastructure information that can be used very tightly within the organization, and one that you're going to need to share with regulators, government officials, et cetera. So I recommend often that you create a couple of these recognizing that at some point you're probably going to have to share some of this with some of the other with some outside folks, even including NERC and FERC. So how long does it take to do these things? Months. It depends a lot on the amount of data and what level of studies you're wanting to do. But I will note it really is a bit different coming in, looking at a facility and thinking about how somebody with knowledge may try to take that facility down versus, you know, storm hardening and weather-related events and how to harden these facilities from weather. So it is two different views. Go ahead, Rocky, to the next slide. So what I have here are some samples of things to be looking for in a detailed assessment, you know, of the facility vulnerabilities, and you'll see that there's cable trenches. A lot of issues these days with the control buildings that I see. The little control building here in the center is what's called an impact. Many of you, if you've done physical protection, system protection, nowadays vendors tend to build these trailers that have all of the equipment, you know, the relay panels, control panels, everything mounted inside of them. They come out on a tractor trailer, you set them off on a foundation, and you put these kinds of cable risers up into them that are typically just covered with sheet metal. Certainly looking at the communications towers and communications equipment, I won't tell you where these are, but certainly this is a pretty significant communication tub, and I will tell you that that particular communication tub was outside of the fenced area, so it would be interesting. Spare equipment, in some cases we store spare equipment on site, in some cases we store it at a single site, and this is a case where it was stored at a single site, a very remote site because there was acreage and really nice access from the outside. These are up against the outside fence of a major substation, and I'll tell you, for miles around there's nothing but cows. This next one is one of the things I was mentioning. It is actually a fiber optic cable that's going to the facility in the background. It's one of two that we're entering that facility, and the other one's literally on the other side of the road, but they're showing you how well you may believe that you have good redundant communications, but if somebody understands how those fibers are leaving, that's the kind of thing that you can see. So some things to be looking for out there. And then the obvious one that everybody knows is, you know, shooting at radiators and taking out some of the radiators in the facility. The next slide, please, Rocky. So physical security and the work with CIP-014 is obviously an ongoing activity. And one of the things that you will have to recognize is it's going to take not only some diligence to ensure that things are being done properly, but continued monitoring to make sure they are. I've got 3 photographs on this one from actual facilities. I won't tell you again where they are, but I will tell you that the first thing is interesting. It's a situation that many of you may have. It's a wiring cabinet out in a switch yard because there was a test switch cabinet for a bus differential. All of your CT leads come into that cabinet. Of course, it's not locked, which is one thing, but secondly, it's a sheet metal cabinet that if somebody knew what they were doing, that would probably be something I would be targeting. The lock is actually a situation of a lock on a 345 kV gas insulated substation control outside, and it's sitting there unlocked. And then, of course, you know, it can't be just looking at our facilities. It has to be what's in the perimeter around us. And I will tell you that the storage building is at a 345 kV switch yard, and you can see how close to the fence it is because the leaves are piled up between it and parts of the fence. So training is key, and you know, Rocky could talk more about training. He obviously his group does a lot of the training activities, so that's really important. Okay, we're on slide 15 now, and certainly some of the things that we like to do, or that I like to do, is take and do an evaluation of some of the designs in the substation and looking at some of the protections. Typically, what you see here are things that we've obviously seen in the past. Everything from strengthening the perimeter. In this upper case is putting basically cables, the high strength cables like you see in between the interstate highways, in the fence line to keep somebody from driving through, and putting up the physical barriers around transformers and equipment. Makes it challenging, obviously, during failures and maintenance to get in and out of those things. So we have to take a look at them. I think there are some things that we can do that will improve our approaches to these, but I think our physical security people need some help, primarily because for the most part, the physical security folks really don't know very much about what's inside of these facilities. And so so far our approach has been based upon the cybersecurity standards, the other CIP standards, and putting in physical security to protect perimeters around the facilities. I think there is some low-hanging fruit and some common sense approaches that we can take to do some of this protection. Next slide, please, Rocky. So when we get to doing a physical security plan and verification, as I said, common sense really does reduce the vast majority of the threats. Simply eliminating line of sight, for example, takes away a large number of the threats. And we know that. We see a lot of utilities that are putting in secondary fences in key places with visual screening, et cetera, taller fences in some of the places to avoid that. But at a minimum, we need to know and protect those facilities that we absolutely can't afford to be without, and we do need to recognize that full protection is impractical, if not impossible. And so we need to invest in mitigation and recovery as well. Also, I like to note that I believe ultimately we have to try to determine where that balance is, because there is a role here in protecting this most critical infrastructure for the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Defense. We can't protect it from guys with rocket-propelled grenades and that can fly planes into buildings or into electric facilities if they so choose to do that. We have to have a partnership with the government and government agencies to make sure that this is working. We also need to understand what the threats are. Threats have been, threats change. Obviously, we never really thought of a threat of somebody coming in and doing a very organized physical attack on an electric substation until we actually had one. So the threats are constantly changing, and we need to keep up with what the threats are, and that's working with our law enforcement and other government officials. Want to go to the next slide, Rocky, please? Obviously, a report on this is fairly lengthy to do the complete thing. I've done several of these. Certainly, you need to ensure compliance with CIP-014, and you can write a separate report that literally details the NERC CIP-014 aspects of this and ensure that without revealing any information that the NERC regions really don't need, that can demonstrate that you've done all of your compliance and due diligence on CIP-014. But full report is going to itemize all the input data and assumptions used in the reviews, going to detail the findings of all the on-site inspections conducted, and identify where those weaknesses are, the vulnerabilities, the shortcomings associated with all of the facilities examined, recommends policies, operations, and our design corrections to reduce the risk that exists, including some potential changes to your standard, if you have standard substation designs, looking at those and saying, here's some things that we need to consider going forward, and maybe hardening up a little bit from facilities that are in existence. And certainly provide options to implement those recommendations, and then our final report will include some review of the physical security plan so that you can document the entire thing meeting the NERC CIP-014 requirements. So some good things that I've seen and some not so good things. Well, you can see some entrance gates here that are pretty secure. Got motion detection on the, if you see the black wire weaved in the fence, that's what's often called a shaker wire. It actually goes through the gate. In a lot of cases, I've seen where it stops at the gate, because when you move the gate, it shakes. Certainly, that's good. This picture at the top is a facility that actually, I'm inside of a secured area, but notice that there's two other sets of gates open going into the substation. There's one here. This one gate actually had a key card access into the warehouse facility, but that gate was just left open. And then once it was open, the substation gate was open. There were delivery trucks coming and going, and so there was a lot of opportunity here for somebody to potentially do harm. The station right below it with the tower in the background, that's actually the green area is the fence. It's so overgrown. Again, this gets into issues with making sure that we're paying attention. I guess maybe that was an attempt to eliminate the line of sight. You got enough vegetation, maybe you can't see what you're doing. And then obviously we've seen a lot of these physical barriers around facilities. But what's in the center of that's actually, you can notice that the pole has a tag on it with an orange marker, and it's actually a fiber optic going up the pole outside of that facility with its communications on it. So I think there's a role here for us to do some work in terms of working with our third-party vendors as well that are coming onto our site to understand how critical this infrastructure is. And Rocky, I think that's my last slide, so I don't know whether we got questions or whether people have questions. But I'd be happy to try to answer some.
Sure, absolutely. Here's a question about CIP version 5 and the methodology of identifying low, medium, and high impact to determine the applicability of each asset. In slide number 9 and elsewhere, you use cranking path as an example. However, in CIP version 5, the cranking paths are designated as low impact and therefore may not be included in the applicability of CIP-014. What's your opinion on that?
I think that's something you have to consider, and my opinion, and I can tell you when we were working specifically for the utility on the West Coast and the one involved with New York, we were looking at cranking paths, and we looked at it from the standpoint of if I think about the 500 to 230 to 115 kV facility, if that was key to my cranking path to getting my system back up, it may not be critical under the CIP version 5, but from a business continuity and customer regulator standpoint, I'd want to know that.
Okay. Do you know the status of the RSOLs and other compliance documents that might be needed for CIP-014 compliance evidence?
I've read. I think the last I saw, there were some drafts being circulated, and I think they're getting very close to having them ready.
Okay. Do you think there will be additional versions of CIP-014 as there have been with the other CIP standards?
Absolutely. FERC gave them some additional direction. If you recall, there was an issue in it where they wanted governmental authorities to be able to designate something as critical. And I think the process for that initially was looking at things like Department of Defense, the military bases, et cetera. And so that was backed off. That ended up getting backed off a little bit. I think just from the recognition that whether we like it or not, we're shepherds of the most critical infrastructure in North America. I think we're probably going to see some revisions to this standard.
Okay, David, one of the participants has sent us a note and indicated that the RSOLs for version 1 have been approved. So I would assume that means they're available on the NERC website.
Yeah, I was trying to remember whether I'd seen them as approved yet or not. I knew I'd seen drafts, so I appreciate the help on that. I knew they're getting close.
Yeah, thank you to whoever submitted that. How about, David, some of the presentations we've made to some utilities together, there's been some conversation about how much of a facility to outage. For instance, a very large substation could have multiple lines in and out of it, multiple voltages. Could you talk a little bit about the smoking hole concept?
Well, certainly, Rocky, and the standard contemplates that. In fact, it requires that we look at if the facility is rendered inoperable. So that gets to be a fairly significant challenge to take a look at what's the impact of taking a facility, the scale of some of these major facilities, and rendering them inoperable. One of the other challenges, and I mentioned how how we have to approach that if we reach a point of instability, cascading, et cetera, then we generally know that we're going to, that if I go further with that facility, it's likely that we're still going to have those kinds of issues. The other side of it might be that if you're, as most of us that do power system studies know, if we're actually dropping load, we may be creating a situation where the system could be more stable. But you have to go with tools then that can do things like looking at the rates of change in voltage and reactive flow and et cetera around a facility for some key outages, and make some determinations of risk based upon your knowledge of the system. The other challenge that comes with making it looking at the smoking hole scenario is a lot of facilities are co-owned, and I've run into that a lot, where it may be that what is a facility. I visited one where one utility owned it on one side of the street, and literally the other, utility B was across the street. Do you consider that as one facility? Same thing with issues where there's sometimes an internal fence, sometimes not. But company A owns one EHV yard, and company B owns another EHV and maybe some lower voltage yards in a facility. And how do you go about looking at that? The overall facility may be far more critical than just the pieces that you own. So that's something else to think about. Hopefully that answered your question, Rocky.
Okay, very good. Thank you. David, a question from the audience. What is the likelihood that the best practices of the mitigation for the Metcalf incident, such as stripping vegetation, bright white lights, etc., will be incorporated into the NERC standards in the future? Have you heard any conversation about this?
Well, I haven't heard any conversations about NERC getting into design standards. I would be probably a little surprised if they start going down that path, because NERC then suddenly is telling us how to do things, and potentially I don't think that's ever a good idea. What you will likely see, and I have seen a draft of a document from FERC, and I asked for an update on that, is some physical security guidelines and things you might do to do that. And I actually usually compare those draft guidelines to what the utility is doing when I'm doing one of these analysis and one of these reports. And so I wouldn't be surprised. In fact, I know NERC has a document out that talks about some kind of a guidance document. I would hope that's where that stays, and it doesn't have to get to be a standard. But we know vegetation was I would have hoped that vegetation never had to become a standard. That we knew we had to keep our lines clear, and trees contacting lines is not a good thing. So we got into a little bit more how-to than I would have particularly liked. So hopefully we won't get that here, but I wouldn't rule it out. I just hope it doesn't happen.
Okay, we have an interesting comment here. A member of the drafting team is on the call with us, and this member assures us that the standard will never be descriptive around what you should do at a substation.
I hope not.
Let's see. There are some additional comments, David, that you might want to address. Since other parts of the CIP standards identify some facilities low impact, what's your opinion that those facilities identified as low impact in the CIP standards can be not included in any evaluation of physical security for CIP-014?
Well, I think from the standpoint that they're low impact, you're probably okay. Just remember that the key is you're going to have to go through the screening criteria first. And so hopefully those low impact facilities will be screened out in the CIP-014 screening criteria. There may be, and I'll leave it at this, they may be, the only other reason that you may want to include it in your own company is if you are considering impacts to other critical infrastructures. You know, I can tell you I drive by, you know, I live in Southern Illinois, my grandkids live in Chattanooga, and I drive by Fort Campbell, Kentucky many times going to see my grandkids. I would guess that most of the facilities out around that military base would be considered to the electric grid pretty low risk. So an example like that might be something that would fall into CIP-014 if you chose, or fall in to your protection, your physical security plan, not necessarily even CIP-014.
Okay, we've gotten some information here from another participant that due out in April are some guidance documents from the North American Transmission Forum and possibly from NERC around requirements 4, 5, and 6. Sounds like something we might be on the lookout for in a few weeks that may help some of the industry to deal with some of this.
Yeah, and I will add that the Transmission Forum has a document out now on, I believe, on requirements 1 and 2, on some steps in that, as well as the peak reliability out west is working on a document as well. So there's certainly some help and some guidance, coming. The challenge is you do have to have somebody to verify this, so you either have to have them separately do the verification work, or I think it's going to be far more effective. The standard allows you to do that collaboratively with your verifier. I think it would be far less costly to have somebody working with you as opposed to coming in and trying to totally replicate your work.
David, one of the things that you and I've talked about a couple of times that I think might bear just a minute or two of conversation from you or observations from you is, there's a difference between being compliant and keeping the lights on. I think one of the things we've noticed in the industry is of course, the regulators are doing their job, and we all get that. But it really doesn't matter how good your audits have been or how many boxes you've checked for compliance. If you have an event on your system, pretty much everything you've done goes under the bus. So would you have any comments or observations about that?
Well, I think that's a fair point, and certainly, what's critical to New York City, as we've seen with all 3 blackouts that occurred there, is probably far different than what may be critical where I live, in not necessarily rural, but it is rural compared to New York City. But at the same time, as we all know, those customers, those people that are you're providing service to, feel equally strongly, probably equally strongly about their service and criticality of it to their ways of life. And so we have to, I think, balance that a little bit, but recognize what is truly, what is not only just critical to the grid, but what's going to be critical to our business, and what's going to end up putting us crossways in the ditch with our regulators, the media, and others. I think we have to think about it from, we have done our due diligence here, and the threats are here, the threats are coming. We all saw this week that some of the threats on the Mall of America. Granted, that's a huge mall and a huge facility, but it's not. It's still not Wall Street. So we're seeing threats in other places. So we need to, I think about it a little bit, and what's going to be important to you and your company and your customers and your regulators.
Okay. Well, David, go ahead.
And I'm going to say, and that may be completely outside of CIP-014. It wouldn't be something that I would include in what I put in my report to justify, to demonstrate that I met compliance with CIP-014. It would be something totally different that I'm doing internally for my own purposes, not for NERC.
Very good. Well, David, on behalf of everybody here and everybody listening in, I'd like to thank you for your sharing your experiences and your observations and your expertise with us. We appreciate it very, very much. So thank you.